Hello, everyone. I'm welcoming everyone on behalf of the Student Leadership and Ethics Board of the Sanford C. Bernstein and Company Center for Leadership and Ethics. And we are inviting you to join us to this fireside chat between me and the former Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis. I'm the Columbia MBA class of 2023. And the conversation here today will focus on the European Union, kind of the transformation it's going through both in the past decade and also the past month, covering everything from the kind of ongoing crisis, different kind of fiscal concerns, inflation, Brexit, Ukraine, Russia war, all these sorts of topics. And specifically, we will ask Yanis for his thoughts on the future of capitalism in Europe, how Western system will continue to adapt and evolve, and progressive frameworks for a more ethical world in finance and business. With that, I want to introduce Yanis Varoufakis. He is an economist and politician who, as Greece's finance minister in 2015, led the struggle against the European Union and the IMF's austerity and bank bailout policies quite famously. And since then, he's co-founded DiEM25, the Democracy in Europe movement, and is the leader of Mira25, DiEM25's political party in Greece. Before his election to Greece's parliament, Varoufakis taught economics at universities in Britain, Australia, the United States, and Greece for more than 3 decades. He holds chair of economic theory at the University of Athens and holds numerous other honorary degrees and appointments at University of Sydney, University of Torino, King's College London, and University of Sussex. He is the author of several best-selling books, which I'm sure many of us on the line have enjoyed and read. So with that, I welcome Yanis Varoufakis.
Well, thank you, Adam. It's very good to be with you. I wish we could be in 3 dimensions, not in 2 dimensions together. After 2.5 years of this pandemic, I've had enough. But on the other hand, we have this opportunity to, for more accessible discussions.
Of course, yeah. We're again glad to have you joining us one way or another. So very much appreciate that. So I mean, we can get it kicked off, and I'm sure you expected this question kind of as it's been catalyzed over the course of the last month or so. But you write a lot about the European project, European cooperation or lack thereof at times, pan-European movements, all these topics that you write and are working with every day. And this has just come absolutely to the forefront over the course of the war between Russia and Ukraine. So as you think about European unity, what that means, how that's been affected over the last month, like how has that changed? Like, how do you think about that in the context of the ongoing war? What's giving you hope? What's giving you concern? I'll leave it open-ended so you can take any direction you want, but how has some of the concerns that you've engaged with over the course of the last 5-10 years changed in the last month?
As we all know, the European Union is the result of an almighty war, the Second World War, a huge carnage in our continent, in Asia, that resulted, nevertheless, there was a silver lining in Europe, the idea of a European Union. Now, in other words, war, however awful and deplorable it might be, can have a creative, uniting effect. I very much fear that this is not the case with the war in Ukraine. Now, the official version is that it is. I see a great deal of celebration amongst the systemic, as I call it, media in Europe, but also in the United States. A great deal of celebration that the West is banding together again. We're putting the band together again, so to speak. NATO has definitely been revived. There's no doubt about that. NATO had no purpose until it found one now, faced with Vladimir Putin. The optimistic scenario, which is not one I share, is that it has been quite remarkable that the European Union and NATO showed an immense degree of solidarity and unity of purpose, standing behind Ukraine, affecting really very harsh and maybe self-defeating to some extent, but nevertheless morally appropriate sanctions upon Moscow. This is all true. But the notion that this is bringing us closer together, and this is going to help the European Union overcome the centrifugal forces that has been tearing the European Union apart, at least since 2008, 2009. That is a hypothesis which I wish I could support, but I can't. And I can't support it because if you look at the foundations of our European conundrum, of our European problem, what are they? That firstly, the European Union, for better or for worse, was created in 1950 as a cartel of heavy industry. Unlike the United States, Britain, Germany, Greece for that matter, states that were the result of an evolutionary process whereby naturally evolving institutions from the ground upwards coalesced to ameliorate for class conflicts, for conflicts between different social groupings. This is how states emerged, even for the Magna Carta, a clash between the barons and the king. Then the merchants came in, then the working class, the proletariat, trades unions clashed with employers, and the panoply of the state emerged in response to the need to create this kind of social contract, if you want. The European Union was created like OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. You know, it was first the European communities of coal and steel. Then we brought in automakers, electrical goods suppliers, large scale farmers with the Common Agricultural Policy, the Rome Treaty. This is a very different beast to a state, the European Union. And because a cartel does always very well during the good times and always demonstrates its fragility and its centrifugal forces during bad times. After the great financial collapse of 2008, you could see that the European Union was fragmenting and dividing and multiplying. We had a north-south divide. Now soon after that, we had an east-west divide. To what extent is the war in Ukraine bringing us closer together? Only at the surface. Under the surface, the architectural fragmentation is becoming worse. Let me give you one small example, then I'll shut up so that this can be a proper dialogue than a lecture. People have been speaking about a common defense policy, even a European army. How can you have a European army when we are nowhere near even beginning a discussion about the federal government? Let's say that we bring together, an army comprising French soldiers, German soldiers, Greek soldiers, Italian soldiers, Spanish soldiers. Let's say 500,000 with tanks and airplanes and everything. Who will send them to war? Who has the legitimacy to send an army to war? The United States has a president, it has a federal government, for better or for worse, whoever happens to be in the White House has the legitimacy to be the commander-in-chief and say, we're going to war, and convene Congress at the drop of a hat to give the president the backing he needs or she needs. Maybe we'll have a woman at some point, to go to war. Who does this in Europe? Macron, Scholz, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, who is only there because she failed at being a politician in her own home country. And there was a stitch up between the German chancellor and the French president behind closed doors to do something with her. And they gave her the presidency of the European Commission without anybody being asked. There's no legitimacy there. How can you have a common army when you don't have a common treasury bill, a common bond? Are we closer to having any of those? No, we're going to discuss this. We are further away than we ever were. So you've got this major clash between appearance, where everything seems to be moving in the right direction in terms of unity and commonality of purpose, and you have the reality, where you have the greatest fragmentation we've had since 1950. When the surface, the propaganda, the appearance, and the reality clash to such an extent, you have a very serious problem.
Certainly, yeah. So I want to ask you then, as a follow-up, because I think it's leading right into where you're going. Then this I guess, legitimation in the mainstream media that comes from this kind of at least superficial uniting that comes around a portion of this, does that then give some staying power to these institutions that need structural reform? Like, do you then fear that then this extends the life, kind of the unreformed model that you're seeing kind of struggle, or kind of you're seeing these fractures in the architecture, it then gives it more legitimate staying power for the near medium term future? And then does that kind of weaken the case or ability for the European Union to reform in any manner it might need to going forward to actually be democratically accountable, to reflect the kind of will of various people in Europe and different nation states? Like, how is that a fear of yours? Is that going to extend the problems forward?
Very much so, I have to say. But actually, it's a bit worse than that, if I may say. Because it's not that there's no change. There's a lot of change. Since 2010, when the Greek state went bankrupt, and that created a huge earthquake, because the bankruptcy of the Greek state was not the issue, really. It was the bankruptcy of the French and the German banks that was the issue. And all that, the reason why you had Greece in the headlines of all the major newspapers in the world was because what was underlying that was that the French and German banking system was gone, kaput. So ever since that happened, we had lots of change, lots of reform. Now, the official version, let me give you some examples of reform. First, we had the Greek bailout, which was absolutely against the spirit and the letter of European Union rules. Bailouts were clearly banned. But they found a way of having it, because there was either you let Greece default, which is what they should have done, or you bail it out against the rules, and then you have to find ways of presenting it as something that was compatible with the rules when it wasn't compatible with the rules. So it's like Macbeth: you commit one crime, and then you have to commit a second crime to cover up the first crime. So the second one was called the European Stability Mechanism, which was like a European IMF. For bailing out banks like Spanish banks, or states like Greece, like Cyprus, like Portugal, and so on. And then the most interesting example of this change, which according to the official version proves that Europe is moving in the right direction, maybe not fast enough, but in my book, it is moving in the wrong direction very fast. A great example was the so-called Recovery Fund, that was instituted, I should say, in June of 2020 in response to the pandemic, because the pandemic essentially, like in the United States, like everywhere else, took a large chunk of GDP out of the private sector, and either you replaced it from the public sector or the whole thing went pear-shaped. So, and because we just don't have a federal government to do that which the Trump administration initially and the Biden administration later did in the United States, they got together and created a fund. And they created for the very first time that which we should have had in the beginning, a form of common debt, a form of a common bond, which, I should be celebrating. I should have, dressed myself in the colors of Europe and gone out in the street and danced all night, because I've been arguing for that since 1998, if I remember correctly, right? But I'm not celebrating. Why am I not celebrating? Because the way they did it was toxic. It was the right thing done in precisely the wrong way with crazily bad results. Let me explain. Yeah. Okay. And I will do it in a United States context. Imagine you didn't have a federal government. There was no Alexander Hamilton, no musical, nothing, right? No common debt, no treasury bills. You had the Federal Reserve, but the Federal Reserve was banned from funding any government. Imagine that. Okay. It could only fund banks. And imagine that in that situation where it's just states, and it is the governors of the states of the states of the United States get together, right? They're panicking. There's a pandemic. They need to fund furlough schemes, helping business, unemployment benefits, COVID, vaccine purchases, procurement, and all that. So they get together and say, okay, now what we're going to do is we'll issue a common bond, but just once, just this time, right? Not never again. So if the great state of Missouri or Mississippi sinks in debt, it's your problem. What we're going to do is we're going to fund some investment in Missouri, in Minnesota, in South Dakota, and so on. We're going to sit around the table today and we agree how much money we're going to borrow together, just this once. So they agreed, let's say 1 trillion, right? It's about 1 trillion that they agreed dollars. We will issue a common bond, but let's, amongst ourselves, the governors of the states, agree on which state gets how much money now, before we even know what the cost of the pandemic will be on each state. And then once we agree, we divvy this big pot of money up together amongst ourselves, right? And it is the governor of each state or the administration of each state that decides who gets the money. In the end, what you would end up with is the more populous and surplus producing states like California, New York State. Okay, the workers of those places, the blue collar workers and lower middle class of New York State and California, because they're the ones who pay taxes, right? The ultra rich don't pay taxes, let's face it. They have fantastic accountants that don't pay taxes. So they will be subsidizing the richer people in Georgia, in Missouri, and Mississippi. Now, you only have to state it in American terms to recognize that that scheme would be lambasted by everyone in New York State, in California, in Missouri, in Mississippi, as a scam. And it would make the prospect of a federation of the United States more distant. So this is why I'm saying that there is change. They do things, but they do the minimum necessary in order to preserve the present system. And by doing the minimum necessary to preserve the present system, effectively they are funding. It's socialism for the oligarchs. That's what it is, for the bankers, for the oligarchs. And therefore, it poisons democratic politics. And the vast majority of Europeans, if you tell them, let's federate, more Europe, they say no.
Yeah, I mean, so then I guess my question to you then is how do we improve this? I mean, this got referenced in some of the pre-submitted questions, right? And I know you're a big advocate for federated Europe. There's certain kind of fiscal unity that you can get here in a way that is not currently set up. But to your last point, like if it's then structured in a sense where people don't like the idea of more Europe, or in your example, more United States in this kind of broken metaphor that you used, like how do you then say, no, the answer is actually more fiscal unity. It's redistributive mechanisms across these different entities. Like how do you transition from the imperfect world we are in today to a better world, whether that's a federated Europe or some other intermediate step? Like how do we actually get from here to there? Because I don't see a world, or I don't see an easy way in which we could flip a switch to move on that path from the situation you just described, which creates a lot of animosity, creates a lot of losers. It's transferring wealth between the wrong parties. It's misallocating resources. How do you then flip that switch?
Look, with every opportunity that we missed the 2010 moment of truth when the Greek state went bankrupt, and you had this domino effect. The bankruptcy of the Greek state bankrupted Ireland, then it bankrupted Portugal, then Spain. That was a fantastic opportunity to move towards a federal scheme for a Hamiltonian moment, right? Something similar to the United States. We missed it. Angela Merkel used all her skills, immense skills, and all her power, immense power, in order to ensure it doesn't happen. Then we had the pandemic. That was a fantastic opportunity again. A crisis, that was an opportunity to federate. Again, we created a recovery fund so as not to federate. Okay. So these, in life, if you get one fantastic opportunity, you are a lucky person. If you get two, you're a super lucky person or continent. We missed both of those opportunities. So the answer now, doing what you suggest, or what you're asking after, is that much more difficult. But I will never allow myself to lose hope, even if all the evidence points to the need to lose hope. So I'll answer. You cannot convince people now to federate, but what you can do is you can give them a taste of the benefits of federation by simulating federation without actually doing it de jure, doing it de facto in ways that are palatable to people. So, for instance, if we were to say, okay, we now have an unsustainable debt in across the Eurozone. It was bad enough before the pandemic. It is atrocious now. I remember, people like, who was it? It was Fitch, I believe, the credit rating agency. They were prognosticating that if the Italian debt to GDP ratio goes above 125%, that's it, Italy is bankrupt. Well, it's 155% now. Greek debt is 212%. We are now on average around 100% of GDP, when the official limit is 60%. These are big numbers and big failures. So here's something we could do. We could all agree that the European Central Bank issues its own bond, an ECB bond, because we don't have a federal treasury to issue it, unlike you. I mean, you cannot have the equivalent of the US Treasury because we don't have the equivalent of the US Finance Ministry. So Treasury. But the ECB could issue a bond to a large issue, something like 20 to 30% of the total euro area debt, and it can use it in order to Europeanize parts of the debt of every country. So, let's say we're on average 20%, 30% above the limit that we should have. Well, take that part and Europeanize it. In other words, take it off the backs of the weak states. So you create a common bond. The bond could have a 30-year life. It can mature, in 30 years. The interest rate will be very close to zero because there's such a dearth of good quality bonds to purchase if you are an investor, whether you're American, Chinese, Greek, or whatever. So they will sell like hotcakes, the ECB bonds. Don't forget, they will be backed by a printing press, unlike the Italian ones and the Greek ones that don't have printing presses behind them. And this gives you, as a European, a 30-year deadline. It's not a bad deadline, 30 years, because effectively, in 30 years, when this thing matures, we have to answer, how are we going to pay for it? And the answer should be a European treasury, following federation. So here, you don't say to people, let's federate today. You say, let's give ourselves a deadline of 30 years to do it. 3 decades, pretty long deadline. Most people will accept that. Most people would accept it. And the deadline effect, even if the horizon is very long, can be it can concentrate minds. It allows us to plan. Okay, so in the next 5 years, we'll do that. In the next 10 years, we'll do that. 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, until we get to the point of federation. Simultaneously, we'd have a proper Green New Deal, a green transition. That, for me, I mean, even in the United States, we need it around the world. We need something like 8% of GDP to be spent in the green transition, primarily green energy. We see this now with the war in Ukraine, how desperately, as a species, we need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels and move towards sustainable energy production, but also sustainable agriculture, transport, and so on and so forth. Buildings. Now, how can you do that? We cannot do it through taxation because our states are fiscally constrained, but we have something called the European Investment Bank, which is 6 times the size of the World Bank, for those who didn't know. It's a very substantial institution. It's based in Luxembourg. So the EIB could the EIB belongs to the member states of the EU. We have it. It's an institution, we have it. Let's use it. Let's give it the green light to issue some 600 billion euros every year of its own AAA rated bonds to create a fund. A fund from which we pay for a green energy union, which we don't have in Europe. It's pathetic. Germany has its own energy plans, Italy its own, France its own, Greece its own. It is ridiculous. So the one area where we should be cooperating is an energy union. Where we have a lot of sun here, not today, but normally we have a lot of sun here in Greece. Germany has a lot of wind. Other places have geothermal energy. Portugal and France have huge waves coming in from the Atlantic that you can harness energy from. But you've got to have a holistic view. So you put more wind power, wind turbines in Northern Europe. You put more solar panels in Greece and Sicily. You put more geothermal here, wave harnessing technology in the Atlantic. But you treat it as one grid, one production and distribution electricity network. 8% of GDP should go to this. It would be fantastic. Technologies would improve. We would compete with the Chinese, who are now wiping the floor clean with us when it comes to solar, wind, and so on. We would be creating good quality jobs, which we are not creating. Capital flows would be smoothened out. These are things. So if you think of these proposals, the ECB bond, the EIB bond, the ECB could stand behind the EIB bonds in a QE kind of way, but they're productive QE, not standing behind the bonds of McDonald's, which is what has been happening during the original QE drive, and that simulates as a federation. It is as if we had a federation without actually having a federation. And if, as I am absolutely convinced, the result of this simulated federation is an improvement in Europeans' lives across Europe, in Germany, in Greece, in Italy, and so on, people will start feeling European. And I would also say, let the ECB write a check for putting food on the table in Germany, in Italy, in Greece, like you have your food stamps. Because, I'm a great supporter of the food stamp scheme in the United States, not only because it puts food on the table of poor families, but also because it's designed by the chairman of the Federal Reserve. And when people in the United States get this check, effectively, whether they're in California or Missouri or in Wisconsin, they feel American. Imagine if Europeans were to receive a check from the ECB, because all the ECB does for them is destroy their lives so far, right? It imposes austerity upon them. Imagine if they got a check and they went to the supermarket with it and they got food for their kids. Then they would feel European. Then in 5 years' time, I think that we would be able to have the discussion of how to federate.
No, I mean, I think that's an incredible answer. And I think that I hope that folks around the world can view it that way. But, it is, the green transition is not going to be an easy one. And I think that's a topic we engage with a lot in modern MBA curriculums. I think that's a concern that a lot of people on the call and the folks I'm in classrooms with are concerned about. So I want to, I guess, ask a specific follow-up. Over the last month, in terms of the kind of green transition, there's been sort of countervailing forces, right? This highlights the need to get off oil and gas because of what we're importing from Russia, but it also, loosens certain other regulations, right? It's the U.S. government is allowing more drilling on federal land. Like, there's kind of countervailing forces to, supply more oil, natural gas, kind of fossil fuel energy in the short term, trading off longer term visions for green transition. Like, how do you view that conversation evolving through the war in Ukraine and kind of the different pressures it's put on the green transition over in the last month compared to what it was 3 months ago, say?
It's not good. I'm deeply, deeply ashamed to be a member of the human race. How about that for a powerful statement? I'm ashamed to be a human. Because we, if you look at us from outer space, we're like a stupid species. We're like a virus on the planet. We had COP26 back in the fall in Glasgow. That was a complete miserable failure because fossil fuel lobbyists effectively upended it and undermined it. And then you have this disgusting invasion by Vladimir into Ukraine, which is a tragedy in itself, being a war. But at the same time, every evil satanic force behind the fossil fuel industry jumped on the bandwagon, and they're having a field day. And you have Biden now, our government here in Greece and every government, saying, oh, let's drill now. Let's get some more fossil fuels and burn them. Let's poison our atmosphere more. What a fantastic idea. We are in a spaceship and we're going to produce more poison in the air in which we breathe, because somehow this is going to be the solution to Vladimir Putin's stranglehold over the fossil fuel industry. We are behaving in a typical way that, game theory 101 that describes as the free rider problem. We are all free riding on each other. And the ones who make an arm and a leg, make a mint, they make billions out of destroying the planet, are expropriating the future from the next generation by selling what is left of their stock of licenses for drilling and burning fossil fuels, whether it's lignite or high quality coal or fracked gas and oil. They are selling it as if there is no tomorrow, and there probably will not be any tomorrow because they are allowed to get away with it.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that is I think that's the right take, and I think that I'm with you. I think it's an existential threat, and it's concerning. And but I do want to transition to one adjacent topic that we haven't talked about, but it kind of runs through all this. And that's the topic of inflation, right? I think that's something you've written about quite a bit, both in terms of how it hurts people whose wealth is primarily derived from wage earning, right? Kind of your more working class type people, but also it's broader and longer term political threats it's caused in the past. So I think as we think about these ongoing issues, how does the inflation concern, both in the U.S. and in Europe as well? I know it's a little bit lesser concern in Europe right now than in America. It's a little bit higher in terms of CPI numbers, but how does that concern you? How does that worry you? Does that kind of complicate any of the other topics we've talked about over the course of the last 40 minutes here?
Well, to begin with, it's a huge problem here in Europe as well, because the averages disguise the situation. If you're a poor European, your inflation is gigantic. It's got remember, there's no such thing as an average person. There are persons who are always doing much better, whether you have deflation, as we did before 2020, or whether you have inflation, as we do here. But let me sum up my answer by saying this. From 2008 to 2021, central banks were struggling to create inflation, and they were failing. They were struggling to put more money into the economy, and they were failing. Now, how can you fail doing that? Well, because if you are constrained by the architecture of your monetary system to put money into the economy by giving it to bankers, this is the only way you can remember the term helicopter money that Friedman evoked or came up with. Well, the helicopter never flew. It was just a figment of Friedman's imagination. Helicopter money would be great. Then you could create, or you could stop deflation, and you could stabilize prices and then increase them if you want by throwing more money out of helicopters for people to pick up and go to the shops and spend it. But this is not allowed in contemporary Western capitalism. From 2008 to 2021, banks, the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, and so on, printed digital money and gave it to the Bank of America, gave it to Deutsche Bank, and so on, hoping that those banks would then lend it to corporations, hoping that corporations would then invest it in good quality jobs, and then hoping that these good quality jobs would generate incomes, which then would result in investment, consumption, and then increasing demand, and then investment, private investment. Didn't happen because while printing trillions and trillions to give to the bankers, they were imposing austerity upon the majority, including Obama. Obama imposed austerity. Even his stimulus, if you take into account the fact that it was small, it was piss weak, and at the same time, the states were contracting, the overall fiscal effect of Obama was negative. It was contractionary. It was austerity. So you had massive austerity in Europe. You had austerity in the United States. You had austerity for everyone, except for the bankers who had socialism through the printing presses of the central banks. Okay, those who always monetarists, gold bags, who always claimed, oh my God, this quantitative easing, all this money printing is going to create inflation. Now they're celebrating and says, yeah, you see, we told you so. This is a bit like us leftists, I'm a lefty, as you know, who, always expect capitalism to collapse. So in 2008, we said to you, we were right. No, we were not right. It just, a stopped clock tells the time correctly twice a day. There's no causal correlation between the functioning of the clock and the predictions accuracy. So between 2008 and 2020, we had austerity for the many, socialism for the bankers, that was backed through the printing presses of the Fed and the other central banks, and deflationary forces. Prices were falling rather than rising. Then the pandemic had the effect of disrupting supply chains. So by stopping the ships from, after unloading their containers in Los Angeles and San Diego and Rotterdam, coming back to China to bring more stuff, right? It created a major interruption. The technological supply chains were broken down. So you had a massive reduction in supply at the time when people were staying at home and ordering more stuff. So that inflation has nothing to do with the monetary policy of the Fed. It's got to do with the fact that we just caused, through a combination of COVID and government policy, a major reduction in supply at a time when demand was increasing. It was not increasing because of monetary policy, it was increasing because we were staying at home and not going to dinner at a restaurant. And we were ordering rubbish from Amazon instead. So inflation starts picking up. Then you have the war in Ukraine, which causes energy prices to go up and disrupts transport as well, because don't forget that 1/3 of Chinese trade was done through Russia over the railway system. And now you have the situation where, up until a year ago, I think almost everyone, including Warren Buffett and the multi-billionaires of the United States, were saying, oh, we need wages to go up because this inequality has become too chronic and too ugly. We need wages to go up. Now everybody, hawks and doves in the United States, whether they are hawks or doves in terms of their relationship to the Fed, right, to monetary policy, whether they want interest rates to go up very fast or not so fast. That's what I mean by hawks and doves. They all say, oh my God, the great worry is wage inflation. If wages go up, we're all damned. So that which was the aim until a year ago now is the curse. But look, this is simply a repercussion of the fact that the 2008 crisis has never gone away. It has simply morphed into something uglier than it was, something that seems to have been ameliorated, but it never did, and now it's coming back to haunt us. It's a bit like a pandemic, like a virus that is mutating. The easy first step, relatively easy first step, would be for three things to happen in one go, as one step. Increase interest rates considerably, because we now have asset price inflation, which is ridiculous, and we have house prices and rents going up through the roof in the United States and in Europe, to the extent that people cannot afford to rent or buy a house, okay? Because house prices are going so up by so much. Right. Okay, do that. If you want people who, somebody will say, but hang on a second, you're asking for interest rates to go up, that means that houses will be more unaffordable. No, loans will be more unaffordable. You will be allowing people with money in the bank to buy houses more easily. And those who don't have money in the bank, well, let's have some social housing, like we used to. Now, what about companies that are saddled with huge quantities of debt, or states like Italy or Greece? If you increase interest rates, they will die. Well, haircut the bloody debt. Excuse my French, but haircut it, pretending that these entities, whether it's Italy or a company that is laden with debt, private equity, you know how they do, they load up debt in order to effectively asset strip the companies that they buy. And then, if the Fed dares increase interest rates 1.5% or 2%, then they all die. Okay, haircut the debt. Haircut the debt. Don't pretend that these are solvent companies. They're not. So go through a process of haircutting the debt and getting rid of the shareholders if needs be. And the third thing that we need to do, a massive green investment program. So increase interest rates at the same time as a QE. You see, the mistake that Jay Powell makes and Christine Lagarde in Frankfurt is to think that because 10 years ago, 15 years ago, first they reduced interest rates to zero, almost to zero. Nothing happened. And then they started printing money. Then they have to reverse it. They will have to stop printing money and then increase interest rates. I'm saying no. Increase interest rates and continue to print money, but give the money where it's needed, which is the green energy transition. Mm-hmm. So there are things we can do, but I'm very much afraid that even if Jay Powell and Christine Lagarde agreed with me, and they dared to do this, they would be decapitated tomorrow by big business and the bankers. So it's a political problem. It's not a technical problem. Technically, solutions abound. Politically, when you have the 1% of the 1% ruling over humanity, taking us all with them to the cliff from which, we'll all go down a terrible precipice of climate catastrophe and social upheaval, where, Donald Trump would look like a Democrat. When you have these people ruling the world, then you have a problem. And this is the reason why there's no substitute for democracy.
Certainly. And I would encourage anyone, there's a few minutes left before we reach the top of the hour to, continue to put questions in the Q&A, but there's a couple in the chat right now and I'll read them off and feel free to take what you want. But this was in response to, I think, your kind of federation conversation and where things can go. But, there are obviously different incentives across wealthy and less wealthy nations. And I think the question is relating to how might those be managed. And then there's another question that was asked if you were able to meet right now with Wolfgang Schäuble, what would you tell him regarding the European debt crisis? So feel free to take either one forward-looking or one historical-looking question.
Well, I'll start from the second one. I don't need to tell him anything because he knows. Last time we were together, and I pressed him, and I said, do you think that it would solve our problems if I did as you are telling me to do? Do you think that don't you think that in 6 months we would be in the same kind of rubbish situation that we are now? He agreed. And when I pushed him and I said, so why are you doing it? He said, don't you understand? I'm sending a message to the French. They cannot have the Deutschmark, he said. And that's what he called the euro, which is interesting. And still retain their national sovereignty when it comes to their budget. So effectively, he never had any serious disagreement with me, but he was using the Greeks as a scapegoat, as a demonstration mule that he was beating with a hard stick in order to pass the message on to Paris. And my response to that was, this is not a good way of running Europe. And he didn't disagree, actually. So I wouldn't know what to say to him today. I can't even say I told you so, because he can then respond, yeah, and I had agreed. So, so what was the other question? The
other question was in terms of your kind of progression towards a more united Europe, right? You propose certain green bonds, green transition. There's obviously different incentives across different wealthy and poor nations. So how would you attempt to align incentives? I mean, obviously there's the existential human crisis, but in terms of actual shorter and medium term, financial incentives, I think that those could differ across wealthy and poor nations. And how might you align incentives to ensure the transition occurs optimally?
Well, I know that in business schools, alignment of incentives is a big thing, but let me tell you that
every course.
Yeah, I know. I mean, this was all factored in what I said. Remember how I described the energy union. So you create a common bond from which you fund an energy union. So you build floating wind turbines in the middle of the Aegean Sea, and you equip every building with solar panels. Now, this is going to benefit Greece massively, but it's going to benefit Germany massively, because who's going to build these things? They're going to get huge contracts. If we electrify transport, and we have from the Peloponnese a TGV, a fast train, 300 kilometer, 350 kilometer an hour train going all the way up to Munich. Who's going to build that? There's no Greek company that can do it. There can be Greek companies that benefit from it, but it will be Siemens and Alstom, French. So the incentives are totally aligned.
Makes sense. And I think we're past the top of the hour here. So I guess I want to say thank you for joining us for this conversation. It was always enlightening to hear from you. And I think that, some of these questions that we're asking, I think we'll be asking ourselves for the entirety of our lifetime, and, for better or for worse. I like you, I'm an optimist, and I hope we can get to a better point.
No optimism. Hope.
Hope.
Optimism is the second cousin of hope, and a very ugly thing. Only idiots are optimists. We have to be pessimistic while hopeful. That's my philosophy, at least, right? How can you be optimistic? There's no empirical evidence that allows you to be optimistic, but hope has nothing to do with empiricism. It's in the heart.
Well, then I hope that we can all walk away with a little bit more hope as we go forward from here. So appreciate you inciting some of that in us and passing on the wisdom here. Thank you so much for the conversation, and we're deeply appreciative here at Columbia Business School for you joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.